And prophets, as we've mentioned before, just to remind you, typically claim the word of the Lord came to them, and we call it an oracle, and it's often in a little formula. They often engage in symbolic activities to underline their words, as we saw with the prophet Hosea and his wife, unfaithful wife Gomer. Woe to you is a standard introductory phrase when the prophets are speaking, probably because they're about to say something terribly bad that's going to happen to Israel. And adherence to the covenant of the Lord lies at the root of all that the prophets say. And the two big issues that they usually talk about are idolatry, running after other gods, and justice or injustice. And just to remind you, forthtelling is speaking to the present situation, which the prophets do, and foretelling is when they're looking at some future thing. And we've looked at the justice of God, which is words of judgment and punishment, because tzedakah means there's no justice without judgment and therefore punishment. And also the mercy of God appears in the prophets and forgiveness, words of compassion and hope.
So today we're leaving the minor prophets where we started with Amos, Hosea, Micah, and we mentioned a couple of others, but we didn't really look at them. All of those minor prophets dating before the Babylonian exile. And we move to the major prophets, the first of which is Isaiah. And the first part of Isaiah is also dated to before the Babylonian exile. Now, you'll see in your notes that there's a standard scholarly division of Isaiah into three parts. That's recognizing what appears to be different style, to some degree different language, and certainly a different context that's reflected, and therefore actually a different theology that's developed. First Isaiah that we're looking at today, the first 39 chapters, after we've looked at Jeremiah and Ezekiel and Lamentations, we'll come back to Isaiah and look at second Isaiah and third Isaiah, slightly changing the order of what was originally announced for this series. First Isaiah, the prophet Isaiah, lived in the southern kingdom in the 8th century, active as a prophet, as the first verse of his book says, in the days of Uzziah, Jotham, Ahaz, and Hezekiah, kings of Judah. And so that takes him through a period of 4 decades when those men were kings. So he was a contemporary of Micah, whom we looked at last week in the southern kingdom. Both Micah and Isaiah would have known about the attacks on towns in Judah that were undertaken by the Assyrian king Sennacherib. You remember that the Assyrians conquered the northern kingdom in 721, and then 20 years later were making a push down south into Judah. That's reported in 2 Kings 18 and 19. Micah seems to refer to it in chapter 1, and we'll have allusions to that also in Isaiah, as you can see. So that's the historical context, and to get an overview of these 39 chapters, our friends from the Bible Project have provided us this material.
The book of the prophet Isaiah. Isaiah lived in Jerusalem in the latter half of Israel's kingdom period, and he spoke on God's behalf to the leaders of Jerusalem and Judah. He spoke, first of all, a message of God's judgment. He warned Israel's corrupt leaders that their rebellion against their covenant with God would come at a cost, that God was going to use the great empires of Assyria and after them Babylon to judge Jerusalem if they persisted in idolatry and oppression of the poor. But that announcement was combined with a message of hope. Isaiah believed deeply that God would one day fulfill all of his covenant promises, that he would send a king from David's line to establish God's kingdom, remember 2 Samuel 7, that he would lead Israel in obedience to all of the laws of the covenant made at Mount Sinai, remember Exodus chapter 19. And all of this was so that God's blessing and salvation would flow outward to all of the nations, like God promised to Abraham in Genesis chapter 12. And it's this hope that compelled Isaiah to speak out against the corruption and idolatry of Israel in his day. Now, the book has a pretty complex literary design, but there's one simple way to see how it all fits together. Chapters 1 through 39 contain 3 large sections that develop Isaiah's warning of judgment on Israel. And it all culminates in an event pointed to at the end of chapter 39, the fall of Jerusalem and the exile of the people to Babylon. But in chapters 1 to 39, there's also a message of hope that after the exile, God's covenant promises would all be fulfilled. And chapters 40 to 66 pick up that promise of hope and develops it further. In this video, we're just going to focus on chapters 1 to 39. The first main section focuses on Isaiah's vision of judgment and hope for Jerusalem, and it begins as Isaiah accuses the city's leaders of covenant rebellion, idolatry, injustice, and God says he's going to judge the city by sending the nations to conquer Israel. Isaiah says that this will be like a purifying fire that burns away all that's worthless in Israel in order to create a new Jerusalem that's populated by a remnant that has repented and turned back to God. And Isaiah says that that's when God's kingdom will come and all nations will come to the temple in Jerusalem and learn of God's justice, bringing about an age of universal peace and harmony. Now, it's this basic storyline of the old Jerusalem purifying judgment into the new Jerusalem. This is going to get repeated over and over throughout the book, getting filled in with increasing detail. So, at the center of this section is Isaiah's grand vision of God sitting on his throne in the temple. And he's surrounded by these heavenly creatures that are shouting that God is holy, holy, holy. And Isaiah suddenly realizes just how corrupt he and his people Israel are. And he's certain that he's going to be destroyed by God's holiness, but he's not. God's holiness, in the form of this burning coal, comes and burns him, but not to destroy. Rather, it purifies him from his sin. And as Isaiah ponders the strange experience, God commissions him with a very difficult task. He is to keep announcing this coming judgment, but because Israel has reached a point of no return, his warnings are going to have a paradoxical effect of hardening the people. But Isaiah is to trust God's plan. Israel is going to be chopped down like a tree and left like a stump in a field. And that stump will itself be scorched and burned. But after all of that burning, God says that this smoldering stump is a holy seed that will survive into the future. It's a small sign of hope, but who or what is that holy seed? The rest of this section offers an answer. Isaiah confronts Ahaz, a descendant of David and a king of Jerusalem, and he announces his downfall. God says that it's the great empire of Assyria who will first chop Israel down and devastate the land, but there's hope. Because of God's promise to David, he's going to send after this destruction a new king named Emmanuel, which means God with us. And Emmanuel's kingdom is going to set God's people free from violent, oppressive empires. And Isaiah describes this coming king as a small shoot of new growth that will emerge from the old stump of David's family. It's this king that's the holy seed from chapter 6. And the king is going to be empowered by God's Spirit to rule over a new Jerusalem and bring justice for the poor, and all nations will look to this messianic king for guidance. His kingdom will transform all creation, bringing peace. Now, you finish chapters 1 through 12 with a pretty good understanding of Isaiah's message of judgment and hope. But when will this all happen? Isaiah saw another empire arising after Assyria, and that's Babylon, who would also attack Jerusalem and actually succeed in destroying it. And that brings us into the next sections of the book. So first, we have a large collection of poems that explore God's judgment and hope for the nations. We learn, first of all, of the fall of Babylon and Israel's neighbors. Isaiah could see that Assyria's world power would one day be replaced by the empire of Babylon, a nation even more destructive and arrogant. And Babylon's kings claimed that they were higher than all other gods, and so God vows to bring Babylon down. And not only Babylon. Isaiah goes on to list Israel's neighbors, accusing them all of the same kind of pride and injustice, and he predicts their ultimate ruin. But remember, for Isaiah, God's judgment is never the final word for Israel or the nations. And that leads into the next section with a series of poems that tell a tale of two cities. There's the lofty city that has exalted itself above God and become corrupt and unjust. This city is an archetype of rebellious humanity, and it's described with language that's all borrowed from Isaiah's earlier descriptions of Jerusalem and Assyria and Babylon all put together. This city is destined for ruin, and one day is going to be replaced replaced by the New Jerusalem, where God reigns as king over a redeemed humanity from all nations, and there's no more death or suffering. These chapters are the climax to this section, and it shows how Isaiah's message pointed far beyond his own day. It was a message for all who are waiting for God to bring his justice on violent, oppressive kingdoms and bring his kingdom of justice and peace and healing love. The following section returns the focus to the rise and fall of Jerusalem. And first we find a whole bunch of poems where Isaiah accuses Jerusalem's leaders for turning to Egypt for military protection against Assyria. He knows this will backfire, and Isaiah says that only trust in their God and repentance can save Israel now, which gets illustrated by the following story about the rise of Hezekiah, king of Jerusalem. Just as Isaiah predicted, the Assyrian armies come and try to attack the city, and so Hezekiah humbles himself before God, and he prays for divine deliverance, and the city is miraculously saved overnight. But Hezekiah's rise is immediately followed by his fall. So he hosts a delegation from Babylon, and he tries to impress them by showing everything in Jerusalem's treasury and temple and palaces. It's clearly an effort to make another political alliance for protection. Isaiah hears about this, and he confronts Hezekiah for his foolishness. He predicts that this ally will one day betray him and return as an enemy to conquer Jerusalem. And we know from 2 Kings chapters 24 and 25 that Isaiah was right. Over 100 years later, Babylon would turn on Jerusalem, come and destroy the city, its temple, and carry the Israelites away to exile in Babylon. And so all of Isaiah's warnings of divine judgment in chapters 1 to 39 lead up to this moment. He's shown to be a true prophet because it all came to pass like he said. But remember, the purpose of God's judgment was to purify Jerusalem and bring the holy seed and messianic kingdom over all nations. And it's that hope that gets explored in the next part of the book. But for now, that's what Isaiah chapters 1 to 39 are all about.
So you'll have to keep coming until we get to Isaiah 40 onwards to see what happens. Or you can read it.
You can read it. And you might have recognized some things in there. When I talk about the New Testament being dependent on Isaiah, if those of you who know the book of Revelation would know that this new kingdom in earth that Revelation talks about borrows completely from Isaiah 1. We come now to what's called the call narrative. Often we have call narratives in the prophets. The most famous one is probably Moses. We all know the story of the bush that burnt but was not consumed, and God speaks out of the bush. And when he asked Moses to do something, scholars call these call narratives, and Isaiah has one as well. And we find it in chapter 6, which is a little bit unusual. It doesn't start with the call narrative, where I've got a lot of predictions well into the book before Isaiah recites what happened. In the year that King Uzziah died, I saw the Lord sitting on a throne high and lofty, and the hem of his robe filled the temple. Seraphs were in attendance above him. Each had 6 wings. With 2 they covered their faces, and with 2 they covered their feet, and with 2 they flew. So we want you to look at this call narrative of Isaiah. It's a little bit longer than just those 2 verses. And have a look in the story where things might be familiar to you from your reading of the New Testament and your participation in Christian worship. Are there some similarities or there familiarities in these particular verses at the beginning of chapter 6 in Isaiah that you resonate with? And as I said, do read beyond the verses 1 and 2, because it goes on for another few verses. So we're going to pop you in your breakout rooms to actually talk about this particular question. I've got to resume the recording.
Here I am is Hanani, which is
Yep.
Oh,
it occurs
yes.
throughout Scripture, particularly so in the story of the call of Samuel.
Yeah, and we get this, of course, in John as well.
But before that, the praising, the praising of God. Holy, holy.
Yeah, and where are you familiar with that, Otto?
Holy Communion, Revelations.
Yeah, Holy Communion, we say, holy, holy, holy Lord, God of power and might, heaven and earth are full of your glory. And it comes based on loosely on this particular text.
Okay.
That's where it comes from, because that's where the seraphs are. And seraphs, of course, are fearsome creatures. They're fiery kind of creatures with 3 sets of wings, so they've got 6 wings. They appear wreaking vengeance in various parts of the Bible. They bring down pestilence in the book of Numbers. The biting snakes are actually seraphs. It's about fiery seraphs being the servants that bite people. So they're fairly formidable, heavenly, otherworldly critters.
Someone asks in our group whether it's not a real creature, but a symbol, symbolic. What's
Symbolic of what?
Well, 6 wings seems to me a superfluity of wings. Why? What a mosquito needs only a pair of them. Why do seraphs need 6? Does that represent something? Is it a sacred number, or is there?
No, it's not a sacred number. 7 is the sacred number, and they'd be a bit lopsided, I think, if they had 7 wings.
But it's 2 sets of 3.
Mm-hmm.
It is. So
Or
no, it's
one
3
for
sets
go
of
and
2.
1 for go and 2 for show.
Kind of. 1 is to go because they fly with 1 set. They cover their eyes with another because you're not meant to look on the face of God. And the 3rd set, they cover their feet.
Because feet are unholy.
Well, feet are very unholy because they're not actually feet at all. What are feet? Come on, tug
Oh,
it
I
on,
do
people.
remember from our other.
Oh, right, yeah.
That's right. Feet are usually a euphemism for male genitalia. So the seraphs have to be decorous to a point in the presence of God. So they've got wings are all utilised, Ian. With 2 they fly, 2 they cover their eyes, and 2 they cover their feet.
But
So they're decent,
Very pragmatic.
as it were.
Yeah, particularly snakes are not renowned for feet.
No, that's right. So anything else from this passage that you talked about that you think is familiar? It's actually a very complex passage. Sue?
The refining fire. There's heaps of hymns that have that in.
Yes. And we find it referred to in other places, including the Gospels, where John the Baptist talks about refining fire and the winnowing fork when Jesus comes, talking about judgment. And we find that in, I think it's in Matthew and Luke, we find a reference to refining fire.
Just setting setting the scene in terms of who was in leadership at the time. We see that in the Gospels in places as well, and in other parts of the Old Testament, you know, so-and-so was the king, or so-and-so, those kinds of things. But in our group, we had a couple of different translations, and in verse 10, it says, you know, make the people's minds dull. The one I'm looking at, which is a contemporary version, says make them stubborn.
Yeah, I'm glad you raised that, Patty, because were you in my classes? I know Otto was. If you're in my translation classes, you would have been served up Isaiah 6.
No, not translation, just biblical studies.
Well, I did translation in biblical studies.
Oh.
This would have been the translation session. I did serve up Isaiah 6 because Isaiah 6 is a very complex passage, and the translations of a lot of the words there are just studied guesses. If you've got a study Bible, you will note that there's at least 10 footnotes saying meaning of Hebrew uncertain. What are the doorposts or thresholds? Nobody knows. So you'll find they're translated differently. And other words are translated differently because they're rare words and you have to guess from context. And if this is the only context they're used in, then you don't have a lot to go on. So because we know it's sort of this vision in the temple, scholars make a calculated guess as to what a lot of those things are. And coming back to the seraphim, there's a lot of classes of angels in the Hebrew Bible, and I wouldn't say that they're all symbolic. They all have functions. There's the cherubim, and God sits on them. That's their job, their thrones. Occasionally they go out with chariots, and they can be harbingers of God's judgment, but mainly they're the throne of God. Then you've got the seraphim who sit there singing holy, holy, and have been known to bring the occasional pestilence of plague upon the human race. And then there's the Malachim, and they're the most important. The Malachim are the equivalent of the Evangelion, that is the angels or messengers in the book of the New Testament. And they are the messengers that you get floating around delivering things. They talk to Hagar in the desert, for example. The Malachim visit Abraham in the tent to tell that he's going to have a child, that he and Sarah will have a child. The Malachim are climbing up and down Jacob's ladder. So they are the people, they are the angels or the messengers that come between heaven and earth, and they do God's bidding. So Malachim pop up quite frequently. So I'm going to guess, Ian, they're probably not symbolic. They actually are supernatural creatures that the ancients believed inhabited the realm of God, though the only ones that they were closely acquainted with were the Malachim, who came down and brought messages from God to human beings. Any other thoughts?
Do seraphims and cherubims feature in present day Jewish theology, or do they put that in the category of, Old Testament fairy tales?
With some of them, you probably find it varies. One, Judaism isn't a monoculture. It's like Christianity. It's got its sects and its denominations, and you've got like Hasidic Jews who are highly conservative through to the Reformed tradition who have female rabbis. So Judaism isn't a homogenous whole. So that's one point. And you'll probably find Reformed tradition probably wouldn't see them as actual creatures, where if you go to the really traditional, very conservative Jews, they may well see them as creatures that inhabit the Holy Realm. You'd probably find most Jews have some belief in the Malachim, whether they see them as angels or whether they see them as human beings that have done something angelic to help other human beings. So they're like a visiting angel or a helping angel. You will find the whole range of views as you do in Christianity. Okay, well, we probably should move on now to our next segment, because Isaiah is a very exciting book. I hope you're all excited by Isaiah. You should be. If Isaiah didn't exist, you wouldn't have a New Testament.
Did you want to do the call narrative bit or jump to the next passage?
Oh, we can do the call narrative bit. Having talked a lot about call narratives and having a look, what we want you to do is have a look at the individual elements that you can find that might set out a call narrative. Now, if you've read the notes, you'll be able to do this very easily. If you haven't, it might be a guessing game. What do you think the elements are in a call narrative? What are the sort of things that, when we look at it, and this is a discipline called form criticism, what are the elements in this narrative that we find repeated in other call narratives? Oh, welcome back. So, did you find out the elements of a call narrative, do you think? What do you think they are?
Cleansing.
Cleansing? Yes. Yes, that's a half of, it's the second half of something that's got a first half. What would be the first half?
A greeting.
It seems that God is the one who always initiates the encounter, the conversation.
Yep. So that's a good point, Otto. God initiates the encounter.
Yes.
Yep.
And we were just talking briefly at the end, and it's usually something that you don't want to do, or it's going to be very challenging. It's not just simple.
Absolutely. That's the first half of the cleansing bit. Generally, someone says, I am not fit for purpose. Because Moses says, I stutter and stammer and I can't do this. And God's ended up getting very testy with Moses in his call narrative. Here you have Isaiah saying, woe am I am a man of unclean lips. So, of course, he's cleansed. And once he's cleansed, God says, who shall I send? He says, send me. We're going to pop a call narrative up now so you can have a look at the elements. Now, call narratives don't always have every element that scholars have identified, and they're not always in this order. They can move around, but this is generally what they look like. So we have some sort of greeting from Yahweh saying, behold, or I am here, or whatever. Then we have a commission, an objection from the person, and there's some sort of divine reassurance. and then there's some sign to confirm the commission, and that generally is what happens. But some of those things can shift around and you don't always get every single one of them. But there's enough similarity that it's they're easily identifiable when you're reading your text. So that's just a little bit of form criticism with call narratives, because of course we're going to encounter other ones as we explore the prophets.
So we've actually jigged the order around. Curiously, Isaiah's book doesn't start with the call narrative that we've just discussed, but actually with what is like one of his key oracles.
Yeah, and we've encountered this oracle. We've mentioned it before when we were going through what Zedekiah or justice is in the Old Testament. And this complaint that's also found in Amos and some of the other prophets. What are your sacrifices to me, says the Lord? I've had enough of your burnt offerings. I do not delight in the blood of bulls, lambs, goats. When you appear before me, who asked you this from your hand? Well, God had, but, you know, we'll just ignore that. You trample my courts. Bringing offerings is futile. Incense is an abomination to me. So all of the ritualistic trappings of worship and sacrifice that occur in the temple, God is rejecting and saying, cease to do evil, learn to do good, seek justice, rescue the oppressed, defend the orphan and plead for the widow, which is at this is this week's reading, of course, from Isaiah 1, and it's at the heart of what the prophets talk about. And we've seen this theme before, that if you just worship without actually living your faith, then God isn't particularly interested in that worship. So when we're not offering animal sacrifices and we don't have pre-slaughtering creatures, which is good, we don't necessarily have official prophets in the uniting church, though we have some people with big mouths perhaps. The words of Isaiah still resonate. What exactly do our rituals mean today? What about Sunday worship? What does that mean? How do you think God likes it or not likes it? What does it mean to be? How do we hear and practice God's call for justice? And there's a whole lot of, I like rhetorical questions. There's a whole bunch of them that you're going to get hit with. I'm sorry if you're in Tuggeranong Uniting Church on Sunday. Are we one of the well-off and moral leaders in society that the prophets are condemning? Do we pay more attention to what we do on Sunday with like our rosters than we do to the fact 15 million children die each day from poverty? Do we put church dollars and our energy towards alleviating the structural problems that cause oppression and poverty? Do we spend more time debating and less time acting in relation to matters of injustice in our church? Now, I do not expect you to answer all of those questions. In fact, you may not be able to answer any of them, but I'm going to challenge you to think about what is Sunday worship about? Would Isaiah be happy with what we're doing today, for example, if he blew into our churches? And you might like to pick one or two of the other questions in relation to how we hear and practice God's call for justice. And we'll give you a decent amount of time on this one, I think.
People the courage and confidence to go out and do challenging things. And if you don't have some kind of safe, I mean, she didn't actually use these words, but safe underpinning, then it's much more difficult to go out.
Yes, that makes a lot of logical sense. But I want to ask you now, is that actually the reality of our churches?
Often not.
Exactly. And if people feel safe and comfortable, they're less inclined to take risks, is my experience as an intentional interim minister, where I'm paid to actually create anxiety and chaos to try and move churches on. If it's true, Patty, if you find them sitting happy and comfortable with their rituals, they are very uninclined to do anything different.
Yes, but they'll keep paying money into the plate.
They will. But, you know, it depends on what you want. Do we want it safe and paid money into the plate and sit there doing the same thing Sunday after Sunday, maybe talking and praying and singing about doing these things about justice? Or do we actually want to do it? And if you want congregations to do it, you've got to metaphorically turn a fire hose on them. So they're all wet and sodden and dripping and they don't like their uncomfortable wet clothes and they need to do something to change them.
They might sack you in the process.
I
I've
think
never been
often they're
sacked
looking
yet.
for their own needs to be met.
Is Jesus about meeting our needs?
No, I think he's encouraging us to move into a new area of life.
Yeah. Was Isaiah in that chapter about meeting the needs of people?
I think it depends on what kind of need you're talking about. I mean, as I said in my group, the NCLS survey said that we wanted to concentrate on nurturing worship, or worship that is nurturing. And I asked the congregation what they considered nurturing worship to be. And for me, nurturing worship is something that helps me to look at what the Bible's saying and how it's going to grow me and challenge me and help me to move on. Because if I don't grow and challenge, I get really bored, and there's not a great deal of point in being alive any longer if I'm just going to sit in a spot. And I think we all have some level of need to be challenged and helped to grow.
Yeah.
But sometimes that's overcome by the inertia of being safe and comfortable.
I think people often don't see their need as a need to be challenged, Judy. In congregations, people see their need is to be, almost entertained in worship. It's a very passive thing. We consume worship. It is not interactive unless you're doing the odd interactive prayer with a call and response. It's someone's up the front. It might be the minister, it might be a lay leader, and they preach, and somebody else might do some reading or some praying, but basically everyone else sits there and consumes that. It isn't a very active thing. And where ministers might like to kid themselves that their sermons are setting off flaming inspiration in the brains of their congregations that will lead them to go out and change the world, the reality is that's probably not what's happening.
I've also had people say to me, older people, during my life, everything around me has changed.
Yes.
And I don't want church to change because it's the one thing that's been constant. And I bite my tongue and say, well, that's kind of tough, isn't it? Because the church has to change or it's going to die. But I don't say it quite like that to them, but that's the reality.
It is the reality. And I come back to what I said, Judy, and if people are comfortable, they won't change. If people are comfortable, they won't do things differently. You have to stir them up and be an agitator if you want things to be done differently. And what do you said, Piers, wouldn't congregations sack me? Well, none of them have done it yet, and I've stirred them up with a big stick. Tuggeranong will tell you I've stirred it up with a big stick. They haven't sacked me yet. And they're doing a whole lot of new things, and they're enjoying doing them. So I think ministers are very averse to taking risks in the same way I think congregations can be averse to taking risks. And maybe we've lost something of the prophetic edge to our messages and to our discipleship and to what we actually do in the world, in our mission, that we might like to think about and how we recaptured that. Anything else people want to share?
We talked about rituals, and rituals can be really comforting and rich, but sometimes we forget the meaning behind the ritual. And that's when it can become something that just happens and we don't understand why anymore. So sometimes we need a reminder of why we do that in church. Why do we stand here? Why do we whatever?
I agree. Do you all know the story of the fable of the tied-up cat in the Buddhist temple? Yeah, some of you do, obviously. There's a monk who had a cat, and it used to interrupt the monks at prayers, so he tied it up so it couldn't interrupt prayer time in the morning. And over time, the monk died, but they kept tying up the cat, and then the cat died. And then they thought, oh, we haven't got a cat tied up during prayer. We better get a new one and tie it up. And then someone new came to the monastery and said, why is that cat tied up while you pray? And they said, oh, we've always done it that way. No one could actually say why the cat was tied up, but, when it died, it was replaced. It's a good thing to remember because around churches, there's tied up cats everywhere. one of the tied up cats I found at Tuggers is, and those of you on the church council might remember this, I said, why do you stand around in a circle to receive communion? And no one could tell me, not one of them. And it really came down to, well, we like it and we've done it for this way for quite some time. And I said, right, come back to the next church council with a theology of why communion needs to be done in a circle. And we'll talk about it. Because I couldn't see the point. No one told me. I mean, we still did things in a circle at times. We don't now because of COVID. But to me, that was a tied up cat in Tuggeranong Uniting, because no one could actually say why they did it that way, other than they'd done it that way for quite some time and they liked it, which I didn't think was a particularly good reason, but that's just me, because ministers are meant to have inquiring minds. Anything else people want to share?
I think too, with the rituals and things like that we have in our church, there's nothing wrong with what we do, but if people walk out of that church after an hour or an hour and a half or however long it is, and they don't do anything else for the rest of the week, then that's meant nothing. Absolutely nothing. So if they're just doing 1 hour worship a week, or they might be reading their Bible or praying, but they're not doing it with the right heart. They might be volunteering, but doing it for the wrong reasons. It might be great to go volunteer at that homeless shelter, but if you're doing it so you can brag, oh, look, I work down there 2 hours a week, look at me, I'm great, then that means nothing to God. It's great for the homeless people because there's an extra hand dealing out the meals, but it means nothing to God. That's really hollow worship.
Yeah. And the question why we do what we do, the mayor, I attend the Rotary changeover dinner about 3 weeks ago, and our mayor said that Sutherland Shire has the highest number of volunteers in the whole of Australia per capita. And I know some people in Legacy and Rotary, they're not Christian, but they're committed. So we need Elizabeth, why we do what we do. We need to know why we do, especially in light of the recent 2021 census data. So we need to know that why we do what we do. What differentiates me from the other volunteer who, with no judgment, why we do what we do.
That's right. And we need to think about what the gospel actually looks like, as the synoptics in particular describe it. What does Jesus say about the kingdom of God or the kingdom of heaven? What is required of us as faithful disciples? What are we required to do, and are we doing it? Now, I'm not asking you to answer that now, but this is really the big question we have to think about. Do we just want to go and get a nice, comforting feeling for an hour or so on Sunday, or 2 hours if you count morning tea, because morning tea is often more important than worship in some churches, I've observed. Is that what we want? Or are we actually there for a greater purpose as disciples? And what is that greater purpose, and what should it look like? So these are questions that should be bothering all of us, including me. I mean, they do bother me, these questions about what that looks like. And we need to constantly think about these things.
So we're going to move to the passage that's set in the lectionary for next week, which is chapter 5, which starts, "Let me sing for my beloved my love song concerning his vineyard." So if you can have Isaiah 5, 1-7, read that through, and then in groups, just for a few minutes, respond to that love song. What stands out for you in this love song? Back into groups.
Oh, welcome back again. How did you go in your groups with this love song? What stands out to you about it? Does anything stand out to you about it?
It's a sad love song. It's a lament.
It's a sad love song? Yeah. What makes it sad, Ray?
Oh, look, God's done this amazing thing. He's got these expectations. He's planting this amazing vineyard, metaphorically, that kind of thing. And he's got these great expectations, and he's let down.
Yeah.
That's it in a nutshell. And he's like, and then, consequences from there. But someone in our group said verse 7 sort of summed it up, really, with the vineyard of the Lord Almighty is the nation of Israel, and the people of Judah are the vines he delighted in. But he looked for justice and saw bloodshed, for righteousness, but heard cries of distress. So that's really, it's summarized.
Yes. Yeah, it does sum it all up. It's a nice little window into the minds of the prophets, actually. It sums up a lot of their message generally. Any other comments people would like to make?
The Robert Alter version had jaundice instead of bloodshed. So it's not just violence, it's disease.
Right. Well, if Robert Alter says that, I have to take that seriously, Sharon.
It's not just a message for the people of Judah and Israel, whether it is 1,000 or over 1,000 years ago, or over 2,000 years ago. It's a message for us too, isn't it, though?
Yes. I would like to think so, Beers.
Well, I'm sure it is.
Yeah.
And of course, Jesus is repeating this, particularly in the Gospel of Luke. The prophets are paired with Luke in the lectionary for a reason. Jesus barely opens his mouth in Luke without something from the prophets coming out of it.
But he tells this story, doesn't he?
Mm.
Yes.
Yes. This metaphor of the vineyard occurs in a number of Jesus' parables in various ways. So yes, he does.
For it to be a love song that works, it needs to be two-way. It's the other side of the relationship.
Yes, and that gets back to what we said earlier about the covenant relationship. A covenant did have two sides, and there were two parties that agreed to various things they would do. So it's the covenant here has really been violated, has it not? That's part of this sadness of this love song.
I always find this metaphor of the children of Israel, or human beings in general, being compared to plants interesting, because a plant does not have any choice. If you plant wheat seeds, you will get wheat plants.
Hopefully.
Yeah, but I mean, the plant can't decide what it's going to become. There are external influences that make it. So you can do all the right things for your grape crop, but if the weather's bad, then you get rotten grapes. But human beings have a choice. And so we are, to a significant extent, in charge of the consequences of our actions, or the what's going to happen, because we can choose which actions we take. Unlike the grapes, we can choose to do what God wants us to do, rather than allowing ourselves to be buffeted around by the stuff around us. And so I'm never quite sure what to do with this metaphor when I'm preaching, other than point out that we have choices that the plants don't.
Well, I would suspend disbelief, because it's a very popular and common metaphor. And
Yeah,
the
I
Gospel
know.
of John uses it a lot, because in John we have the vine and the branches and the gardener. And the gardener is very instrumental in things like pruning, so more fruit comes. But you've got to be receptive to the pruning, I suppose, is where the metaphor is pushed.
Yeah,
so
and
you do bear that fruit.
And you can certainly get that fatalism. I have no control over this. It's God's will.
Yeah.
So I just have to sit back and let happen what God wants. And there are some places where that's true, but other places where it's not. I do have a choice. I can do something. I can choose to do this rather than that. And I'm not just stuck with God's will.
No, you're not. And nowhere in the New Testament, in the Old Testament, really is anyone just stuck with God's will. Everyone can make a choice, whether they're going to do good or evil or something just plain silly. You have a choice.
Yeah,
Rarely
but
does God force something upon you. It happens occasionally.
But often the thing is, God, my child died in a car accident because of God's will, is where this sort of thing comes to.
Yeah.
Sorry,
yeah.
I'm taking you off topic, but
No, that's all right, Judy. I would say that that's a real misinterpretation of what's being said here, and it's taking the metaphor to a place it was never meant to go.
Yep.
Yeah, because Israel always has a choice.
And so we step out of the metaphor, if you like, in the last verse of the love song, And that's where that nice play on words happens, which I think is explained in the notes, that he expected justice, mishpat, but he saw jaundice.
Or bloodshed.
Mishpat.
Yeah.
Expected righteousness, tzedakah, but heard a cry, tse'aka. It's a really neat word play. Just to note that the two words translated here as justice and righteousness have slightly different nuances. Tzedakah connotes conformity to a right standard, whereas mishpat is actually the judgment that is handed down in a courtroom setting about a
or by God.
Or by God acting as the judge, yeah.
Actually, what Alter does is try to pick up the wordplay. He says, hope for justice and looked jaundice, hope for righteousness and look wretchedness. So he's trying to pick up that wordplay from the Hebrew a bit.
Yeah.
It's very hard to get Hebrew wordplays into English, and that's not a bad attempt.
No.
And I have to say, of all the Isaiahs, 1, 2, and 3, they are the wordsmiths of the Old Testament. Their poetry and their capacity to use different literary devices and wordplays is unmatched. It's really superlative. So this is just a little example of how clever these writers are with their language.
So what follows after this love poem is a searing denunciation of the societal ills in the nation of Israel. And that at the end of chapter 26, or towards the end of chapter 26, that leads Isaiah to say these words: God will raise a signal for a nation far away and whistle for a people at the ends of the earth. Here they come, swiftly, speedily. And so their arrows are sharp, their bows are bent, their horses' hooves seem like flint, their wheels like the whirlwind, their roaring is like a lion, remember Amos? Like young lions, they roar, they growl and seize their prey. And this is taken to be a reference to the Assyrians, who he knows have been growling and roaring in the north. And the map indicates the expansion of the Syrians that takes place in the century when, or in the half century, when Isaiah is active. So originally the purple in 745 BCE, spreading to the green under Sargon in 714. And in fact, the foray down south, which is what Isaiah seems to be speaking about at the end of chapter 5, when Sennacherib comes down south into Judah, but then he is pushed back after that, and it's another century or more before the southern kingdom falls. But the threat of the Assyrians is seen to be really quite powerful. And there's a list in your resources, or a little diagram of the various Assyrian kings that pressed in terms of Israel first and then Judah. So it's in this context then that we get these oracles that are very familiar to us, chapters 7, 9, and 11. They're very familiar from Advent, Christmas, the service of lessons and carols that often happens before Christmas, about the one who is coming into this context. So we are in the Christian church very schooled in understanding the pronouncements of Isaiah in chapter 7, 9, and 11 as foretelling, looking forward centuries to the coming of Jesus. And we can find ways in which Jesus fulfills those prophecies, so to speak. In fact, Matthew takes you shall name him Emmanuel, and puts that right at the beginning of his story of Jesus, as we all know. But in context, we have to ask the question whether Isaiah is foretelling so far ahead, or is he forthtelling? That is to say, he knows that Assyria is pressing. He's been able to see what's happened over the last 30, 40 years, and he is indicating some hope to the people of Israel in the face of the Assyrian threat, that there will be a ruler, that there will be a time which will vindicate them, which will remove them from the Assyrians. So have we got time to do? We've got a couple of minutes just to ponder about the foretelling. Do you want to do that in groups or together?
We'll do that in the big group, John, I think, because we're getting close to time. So what question do you want to put?
What do you think about whether Isaiah is forthtelling or foretelling? And what's the implication for us as we read the...
Can he be doing both?
Nothing like a bet each way, Jenny.
Or in Spanish, poco no les dos, los dos.
You know, in looking at Isaiah's talking, I would say it's probably in Isaiah's eye, it's more forthtelling. Because he's talking to the people about what's happening at that time, isn't he? He's talking about the vineyard and what he's grown. He knows the Assyrians are devastating them and that it's likely to even get worse. So I think possibly in his eyes, he was forthtelling.
I mean,
talking about Jesus at that time is a long way ahead.
I mean, these are really good examples of how when we read something, when we read literature, we might be able to see layers of meaning, levels of meaning. A number of the children's stories that Elizabeth tells in church are kids' stories about, you know, this funny thing that's happening or whatever. And yet we hear that and go with that level of the story, but we also can sense the underlying dimension that's happening. I mean, good poetry is like that. It says one thing, but the imagery evokes deeper things. So is prophecy the same? Is prophecy able to operate in different levels? I mean, my sense is that we've been so schooled in the Christian tradition of seeing that particular level that we don't even think the other level is there. We get so hooked into the foretelling that we forget the forthtelling.
We're very interested in how it relates to us rather than how it related to them. But there's probably not a great deal of, I mean, why would Isaiah be saying to the people of his time, look, at some stage in the future, this thing is going to happen, rather than if you people don't get your acts together now, this thing is going to happen really soon.
Yes, that's my thinking, that it's current.
Yet the New Testament writers, and I keep telling you, no New Testament without Isaiah.
No.
The New Testament writers took these words and applied them to Jesus.
But that's what they did, isn't it? I mean,
yeah, it is what they did.
That's what they did. That doesn't mean to say that Isaiah had that in mind when he spoke them.
Oh, no, that's right. But certainly it was seen by the early church as a way of describing what they thought Jesus was and doing.
I agree with that, but I'm looking at it from Isaiah.
Into the whole story.
And on the road to Emmaus, what was Jesus detailing to the people? Was it not from Isaiah?
Oh, look, I think that's all right, true. I don't have a question, but I'm thinking of it from Isaiah's point, the other end of the spectrum.
Well, it wouldn't be particularly hopeful for people in his time, would it, if it was something that was going to be a millennia in the future or 500 years in the future?
No.
That is not conveying hope to the people at the time. So, I mean, what you're saying makes perfect sense around that, Enid.
It was part of Isaiah's faith in God that he would do something to help in the end.
Yes.
But probably not in 700 years' time.
No, in the immediate thing. Looking for hope,
Yeah.
Although, I mean, maybe, as I said, it's both.
Yeah, maybe it is.
This is going to happen now, and also God has a longer view of history and will be with us not just now, but to our children's 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 children. Children.
Which raises the issue where is our hope now in all that we face as a planet?
Do we want to know what's going to happen in 700 years' time or in the next 50?
Yeah, that's a good point, Enid, because what's going to happen in 700 years' time might mildly interest me, but I'd be much more interested in what happens in 50 because that will impact me and my direct descendants.
That's right.
10 years.
10 years.
You may not have any more ice caps or.
Yes.
No, we may not.
All right, folks, we're at time. We're over time. And for next week, we're going to move into Jeremiah, but we're going to start by looking at the prophet Huldah, who's one of the lesser known prophets, a female prophet, who was operating around the same time as Jeremiah. So for this historical context for Huldah and Jeremiah, it should read 2 Kings 22 to 23 and 2 Chronicles 34 to 35. That S shouldn't be there. It was incorrect in your material that I sent you. But both of those tell the story of Huldah, and Jeremiah is operating at the same time. And then you might like to read the first 4 chapters of Jeremiah, and perhaps you're welcome to read on into the rest of the book. We'll start into Jeremiah next week, and then the week after we'll do Jeremiah and Lamentations.